When it comes to Tears of the Kingdom, I was somewhat late to the party. The game came out in May of last year, and I wasn't able to get around to playing it until this January. I spent literal months doing everything in my power to avoid spoilers and discussions of the game as best I could. And though I did wind up hearing about a few minor details, I was thankfully able to go into the experience mostly blind. As a whole, I thought Tears of the Kingdom was a pretty solid game. A 7 out of 10, in my opinion. I felt the narrative was a bit lacking compared to Breath of the Wild, and especially Age of Calamity, but it's only with time that I've really started to absorb the faults in this game's story. Tears of the Kingdom's biggest flaw, by far, is how utterly disjointed it feels from the rest of the series, including Breath of the Wild. There are already a slew of other video essays going over this exact topic, but I find myself sharing the sentiment. Tears of the Kingdom suffers from a major identity crisis. At once, it wants to be a continuation of Zelda's long-running legacy, while also not being beholden to anything that comes before it, not even its direct predecessor with whom it shares a continuity. I think that, on its own, Tears of the Kingdom has a pretty decent story. The problem is that it can only stand on its own, which is very hard to do when it's the latest entry in one of the most iconic series in all of gaming. Again, there are plenty of other videos out there that explore this specific issue in depth, so I don't feel like I'm adding much new to the conversation there. With that said, as always, I'm not content to simply criticize something without offering my own suggestions on how I think it could be improved. This rewrite is going to attempt to address the key issue that many fans take with the game's story, the lack of cohesion it has with the entire rest of the series. While it's not perfect by any means, I'm trying to keep the overall vibe of this still being a new era of Hyrule while connecting it loosely to the rest of the franchise. With all of that out of the way, let's begin. In an age long past, the world was engulfed in a terrible war. People of all lands and races coveted the might of the Triforce, a sacred relic said to be capable of granting any wish. Nations were felled, fields were burned, and the world itself seemed to teeter on the brink of collapse. However, a few desperate pleas reached the ears of the goddess Hylia, who sent her children, the Zonai, down from the heavens to answer the prayers and end this war. The king of the Zonai, Rauru, sought allies among the people of the surface who longed for peace. For many years, the Zonai and their allies fought to bring an end to the war, routing all who wished to misuse the Triforce for wicked ends. When all his enemies were bested, Rauru then used the Triforce to undo the damages of the war. Lakes were refilled, greenery was restored, and for the first time in an age, the future looked bright. Humbled by this display of mercy and compassion, the people swore themselves to King Rauru. Thus, the kingdom of Hyrule, named after a land spoken of in ancient legends, was born. Upon witnessing this, the goddess Hylia appointed Rauru and his allies to serve as the Triforce's guardians. And so they became the sages of light, fire, wind, water, lightning, spirit, shadow, and time. To help the sages harness their newfound powers, they were given sacred stones that served as both a conduit for their magic and proof of their new status. Shortly after becoming the Sage of Light, Rauru fell in love with the Sage of Time, a Hylian woman named Sonia. Together, the 8 sages would fight to protect the Triforce and the peace that they had established. However, one sage soon began to resent his duty, Ganondorf, the Sage of Shadow. It is said that only one male is born to the Gerudo every 100 years, and that male is destined to become their king. Ganondorf, however, was not born to the Gerudo royal dynasty, but a band of thieves roaming the desert. Raised by outcasts in the harsh environment of his homeland, Ganondorf came to value strength above all else. Once he came of age, Ganondorf assumed leadership of the thieves and raised them up, even building a stronghold for them deep within the desert. Thus did Ganondorf gain the moniker of the King of Thieves. It was by chance encounter that Ganondorf and Rauru met on the battlefield, fighting alongside each other against a horde of monsters roused by warring factions, a horde that threatened to tear Ganondorf's stronghold asunder. Though they opposed each other on many ideals, the two kings formed a begrudging respect for each other. And so it was that Ganondorf would aid Rauru in his mission to restore order to the world. After the war and his appointment to sagehood, Ganondorf swore allegiance to King Rauru under the pretense of seeking a better life for himself and his people. In truth, having tasted the power granted to him by his sacred stone, Ganondorf yearned for more. It wasn't long before he set in motion a plot to deceive the other sages and claim the Triforce for himself. Using his power over Shadow, Ganondorf roused hordes of monsters across Hyrule to lure the sages away, leaving only himself, Rauru, and Sonia to guard the Triforce's sacred chamber. Ganondorf's plot nearly succeeded, but Queen Sonia managed to intercept him just as the Triforce was within his grasp. The sages of Shadow and Time clashed, though Ganondorf's martial prowess gave him the edge. In a final act of desperation, Sonia used all the power at her disposal to shatter the Triforce, flinging two of its pieces into the future, an act that would cost her life and drain her sacred stone of power. Even so, Sonia's plan was set in motion, that these fragments of the Triforce would manifest when they were well and truly needed. In her final moments, Sonia saw a glimpse of the future, warning Ganondorf that he would be undone by a princess of light and a hero wielding a sacred sword. Disregarding this warning, Ganondorf took the final piece for himself, using the Triforce's power to amplify his already immense strength to godlike levels. This lone piece of the Triforce, coupled with Ganondorf's sacred stone, transformed him into the dreaded Demon King. Ganondorf proceeded to shroud the land in darkness and assail Hyrule with hordes of monsters, intent on taking his rightful place as the world's one true monarch. The remaining sages banded together in opposition of Ganondorf, though his strength proved too great even for their combined might. Just as all seemed lost, however, one of the Triforce fragments that Sonia sent through time appeared before Rauru in his hour of need. With this, Rauru was able to use the last of his strength to imprison the Demon King and end the war at last. Once the battle was concluded, the sages of fire, water, lightning, wind, and spirit came together to plan for the Demon King's inevitable return. They learned of an ancient relic hidden deep within a mystical forest that was said to have saved the world long ago, a legendary blade known simply as the Master Sword. Minoru, the Sage of Spirit, devised a plan to ensure that the Master Sword was uncovered and wielded by a worthy hero when the time came, sealing her own soul within the blade. The sage's sacred stones were hidden across Hyrule, awaiting the day that their power would again be needed and wielded by their descendants. Ages passed, and eventually the Master Sword was found and wielded by a royal knight named Link. whose courage and devotion made him a worthy candidate to wield the blade of evil's bane. Meanwhile, Ganondorf's power began to fester as Raru's ancient seal weakened. Centuries worth of dark energy, fueled by anger and malice, erupted forth as a force of pure destruction and chaos. This living disaster came to be known as Calamity Ganon, and it would lead to the creation of the divine beasts, the guardians, and the four champions to combat it. You all know the story from here, that being the story of Breath of the Wild, and Age of Calamity to an extent. But there's a little more context to be had now. Zelda's power comes from being the new Sage of Light, as Raru's descendant, and her powers awaken when the other Triforce shard that Sonia sent through time manifests within her. The four champions, Mipha, Revali, Daruk, and Urbosa, are descended from the sages and thus inherit their powers, which explains where their magic comes from, but they were never able to reach their fullest potential since the sacred stones were hidden away and forgotten about. After Calamity Ganon's defeat, Link and Zelda set about trying to restore Hyrule. 5 years later, the two discover the ancient Zonai ruins and descend far below Hyrule Castle to find Ganondorf's seal. Things play out more or less the same this time, with some slight deviations here and there. Honestly, that's about where I'm going to end things for now. There are certainly some other details to address, like how all this would radically alter the events of the actual game, but maybe I'll do a follow-up video on that at a later point. This was, as I said before, mostly just meant to be the setup and how I would attempt to better connect Tears of the Kingdom to the rest of the series. So what do you all think? Do you like the changes I made, or would you have gone in a different direction? Leave your thoughts and comments down below, and until next time, stay bright.